بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم وأكمل التحيات على سيدنا ونبينا محمد خير البريات وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, we've reached the chapter on the prayer of the traveler. And here there's an important issue that the commentator, Imam Shrumbulali, will bring in, which is an usuli issue. But part of what Imam Shrumbulali does in Maraqi al-Falah is that he prepares someone to understand the key concepts and key characteristics related to Hanafi legal methodology in a clear manner. So, when it comes to traveling, one of the issues that comes up is that in the Hanafi school, shortening prayer is wajib. Now, this would appear to be a dispensation, but as we will see, it is not, because dispensations are of two types, right? And we touch upon that in Usul al-Fiqh, and there's an actual dispensation, rukhsa haqiqiyya, where there's an original ruling, and the dispensation is a facilitation from the original ruling to a secondary ruling. And then there's something that looks like it is a dispensation, but it is not actually a dispensation. So it's only majazan, it's only, figuratively speaking, a dispensation. And when it comes to shortening with respect to travel, it looks like a dispensation because you pray 2 rak'ahs rather than 4, but as we will see, it is not an actual dispensation. Another of the issues that we'll see in this chapter is that the primary texts come describing the travel that is the basis of dispensations as being the travel of 3 days. So, is that defined by days of traveling, or is it defined by the distance traveled during that time, customarily? And this was a point of contention in the madhab. We'll see what Imam Ash-Shrumbulali mentions, right? And that is what most of the later scholars settled upon. And it works out, which is that the travel of 3 days that's come in the hadiths refers to the distance customarily traveled by normal travel in 3 days, because the normal travel during those times was either traveling by caravan or walking, and people would only walk for a certain part of the day, otherwise it would be too hot to walk. So, because otherwise, how would that apply? How would that apply in 3 days of travel? If someone drove 12 hours a day, 36 hours, you could get across all of Europe, cut across North America, do all kinds of things, and that would not appear to be the what the rulings relate to. So we'll touch upon that as well. Then he'll also describe for us that safar, of course, when it says Babu Salat al-Musafir, safar refers to two things broadly, right? One is any leaving of one's own place of residence, right? One's own town of residence, right? They sometimes call that a safar al-lughawi. And then there's the safar al-shar'i. Then there's the legal travel, which is any travel that is sufficient for the dispensations and rulings related to travel to apply to it. Right? Now, Imam al-Tahtawi mentioned something useful before we look at Bab Salat al-Musafir, that, right, that a safr, right, safr, from which you have the ism fa'il al-musafir, safr is kashf. Its form is like kashf. Safr is like kashf, right? It's fa'al in its wazn, but also in its meanings, because safr is al-kashf, right? You say asfara an wajhihi is a kashafa an wajhihi. He uncovered his face, is to lift something. So it's either lifting of the journey, it's the lifting of the journey, right? As if there's a journey and you lifted off, so you got to the other side. Or they also say there's an akhlaqi aspect to travel, which is لأنه يسفر أي يكشف عن أخلاق الرجال. They say السفر يسفر, travel uncovers. Which is why the ulama remind that the Prophet ﷺ discouraged people traveling alone. Right? Because habits and customs and societal expectations, community, family, these are circles of restraint. When people are taken out of their habits and these restraining elements, it's very easy for them to go in all kinds of funny directions. There are people who go on Umrah on their own. They just go off on their own and they say, I didn't benefit. Yeah, because when you're at home, you're surrounded by people who are religious, etc. You're in a religious routine. Now suddenly, you're sitting in Mecca and you have internet and there's no one around and there's people who struggle, right? And that's why it's a sunnah on whenever possible to travel with others, even if it takes that extra effort. And there are many adab to the musafir. One of the great summaries of the adab of safar is to be found in the Majmu' of Imam al-Nawawi under Bab al-Hajj, and we should share it as a resource here. He mentions about 70 plus adab of safar. From a hadith and from what the ulama have deduced, there's some very beneficial things. Likewise, Kitab al-Adhkar of Imam al-Nawawi not only mentions many of the adhkar related to travel, but also many of the adab related, because there's adab related to before you travel, especially on a long journey. There are adab related to before you travel, and when you're initiating travel, and during travel, and upon stopping during your travel, and at the culmination of your travel, when you reach the destination or you reach home. There are many, many adab. Generally, people are negligent of them. So these can be found in, I know we mentioned them in the adab of safar that are mentioned in the Majmu' Sharh al-Muhadhab. They're also mentioned in Kitab al-Adhkar beautifully. And then the Hanafi books that talk about adab touch upon it as well, whether it be Sharh Shir'at al-Islam. Mullah Ali al-Qari expounds on it, both in his commentary on al-Hisn al-Hasin, in the relevant sections, and also in a somewhat neglected work of his, which is one of the ulama used to consider one of the great abbreviations of the Ihya, which is Ayn al-Ilm wa Sharh Ayn al-Ilm wa Zayn al-Hilm. And that has a very good section on the adab of travel and what the ulama have to say about it. There's, of course, the writings on Islamic spirituality talk about the spiritual dimensions of travel as well. And you can find that in the Risala al-Qushayriya, the Luma of Abu Nasr al-Sarraj. You can find it in Kashf al-Mahjub. You can also find a beautiful discussion on that in the Mabahith al-Asliya of Ibn al-Banna, with the commentary of Imam Zarruq, and also the commentary of Ibn Ajiba. And these are things that one, it's a part of a religious and spiritual cultivation that one should always be working on. Okay. So he says, باب صلاة المسافر من قال رحمه الله تعالى من باب إضافة الشيء إلى شرطه. Right? This is from ascribing something to its condition. Right? Right? The prayer related, arising from travel. Right? ويقال إلى محله, or to its place. Right? Which is the doer, the musafir. The mahal being the musafir. أو الفعل إلى فاعله, or of the act of ascribing the act to its doer. The prayer of the one who is the traveler. Tahtawi, of course, here quotes a Sayyid an al-Hamawi. Al-Hamawi, Sayyid Ahmad al-Hamawi, who is the author of the Hashia on the Shama'il. He also has a Hashia, has the Hashia on Al-Ashbah wa al-Nadha'ir. He also has a Hashia on the Sharh of Mullah Miskin on the Kanz. And Sayyid Ahmad al-Hamawi, he's the Shaykh of the Shuyukh of Shaykh Ahmad al-Hamawi, and he quotes from him frequently, both in his Hashia on Mullah Miskin, and he quotes from him also in his Sharh on Nur al-Idah, and this is an example, right? Okay. وَالسَّفَرْ فِي اللُّغَةِ قَطْعُ الْمَسَافَةِ. Travel in the Arabic language is to traverse a distance, right? Long or short, right? But masafa in Arabic has the sense of some distance, right? So how much would be minimally considered to be a traveling distance? There's some discussion about that, of course, right? How much would be minimally considered traveling some distance? So, وفي الشرع مسافة مقدرة بسير مخصوص بينه بقوله, right? And it is travel is a قطع مسافة, right? It's traversing a distance defined by the traveling, by a specified traveling that he will now define. أقل مدة سفر تتغير به أي بالسفر الأحكام, the least duration by which the rulings change, أي وهي لزوم قصر الصلاة كرخصة إسقاط, from the requiring of shortening as a um, as a lifting dispensation, right? As a lifting dispensation, meaning the lifting dispensation that the original ruling does not remain anymore, right? So the 4 rak'ah prayer is lifted, and all that remains is 2 rak'ahs, right? And other rulings, of course. And he says, وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ الرُّخْصَةَ عَلَى قِسْمَيْنِ. So know that dispensations are of 2 types. رُخْصَةٌ حَقِيقِيَّةٌ وَرُخْصَةٌ مَجَازِيَّةٌ. An actual dispensation and a metaphorical dispensation. وَتُسَمَّى رُخْصَةَ تَرْفِيهِ. And this is also called a facilitative dispensation, مثل الفطر. Right? Right? Now, here there's something that people get confused on. تسمى, and it is called a facilitative dispensation. What does this go back to? To the rukhsa al-haqiqiyya. The actual dispensation is called a facilitative dispensation, in that the original ruling remains, and this is a facilitative ruling. Whereas the mithla al-fitr, such as breaking fast for the traveler or the sick person. وَإِجْرَاءِ كَلِمَةِ الْكُفْرِ بِالْإِكْرَاهِ. And for the one coerced, they have the dispensation of uttering words of disbelief to save their life on condition that their heart be sound on faith. But the original ruling, which is not lying, remains. وَالثَّانِيَةِ, and the second, meaning the metaphorical dispensation, مِثْلَ الْكُرْهِ عَلَى شُرْبِ الْخَمْرِ. Right? And the second is being coerced to drink alcohol. Right? In what sense? Right? If you're coerced to drink alcohol, what's the point of comparison? He'll explain, right? That if you're coerced to that, if you don't do it, you'll be killed, then preservation of life is given precedence. وَقَصْرِ الصَّلَاةِ فِي السَّفَرِ. And shortening prayer when traveling, right? And shortening prayer when traveling. That you don't have a choice. فَالْأُولَى الْعَبْدُ مُخَيَّرٌ بين ارتكاب بالرخصة والعمل بالعزيمة. In the first, which is the actual dispensation, the servant has the choice between taking the dispensation or acting on the azima, the original ruling, the higher resolve. فَيُثَابْ, and they'll be rewarded. And تَصُومُ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ, for you to fast when traveling or sick is better for you, generally better for you. وَثَانِيَ لَا تَخِيرَ لَهُ. And in the second, the metaphorical dispensation, you don't have a choice. لِتَعَيُّنِ الْفِعْلِ فِيهَا بِالرُّخْصَةِ, because the action is specified for you in the dispensation. The original ruling no longer remains. وَسُقُوطُ الْعَزِيمَةِ. And the stricter ruling, the ruling of firm resolve no longer remains. فَلَا يَتَضَمَّنْ إِكْمَالَ الصَّلَاةِ ثَوَابًا. So therefore, praying fully does not have reward in our madhab. Why? لأن الثواب في فعل العبد ما عليه. Right? Because reward is for the servant to do that which is due upon them. What is the ta'ah? Obedience is موافقة فعل العبد أمر الرب. An act of obedience is for the action of the slave to correspond to the command of the Lord. What is the command here? Pray 2 rak'ahs. So praying 4 rak'ahs is not a ta'ah here, because that command no longer, that does not, never applied actually in the case of prayer. to pray in full. ولو بالتخير بينه وبين ما هو أيسر, even if it be by having a choice between doing the stricter or easier ruling. كلابس الخف, right? An example of where you have a choice is like the one wearing a khuf. إنه مخير بين إبقائه والمسح, because the one wearing a khuf, it's a rukhsa حقيقية for them to wipe, so they have a choice between wiping and they're rewarded for wiping, right? Insofar as that they're making a wudu, and insofar as if they intended to follow a sunnah, because the Prophet ﷺ wiped, even if the superior act is to wash. And of keeping it and wiping بين إبقائه والمسح مع المسح وبين قلعه والغسل, and between taking it off and washing. وأما الصلاة في السفر, as for prayer when traveling, فليست إلا ركعتين من الرباعية. Prayer when traveling is only 2 rak'ahs of the 4 rak'ah prayer. فإن صلاهما لم يبقى عليه شيء. If one prays the 2 rak'ahs, nothing remains for you. من المأمور, of that which you are commanded to do or given a choice regarding. فلا ثواب له في الإكمال. So one has no reward in praying more completely. من الإكمال 4 لمخالفته المفروض عليه عينا, because you are going against what is personally obligatory upon you. Right? وإساءته بتأخير السلام, and one has done something blameworthy by delaying giving the salams. وظنه فرضية الزائدتين, and also of imagining that the extra rak'ahs fulfill an obligation. ولا ثواب له بالصبر على القتل. Another, وعدم شرب الخمر بالإكراه بل يأثم بصبره right? And one does not have a reward in being patient, and being killed, and for not drinking alcohol when coerced, right? That if you have a threat of death and you could preserve life by drinking alcohol, preservation of life is given precedence over avoiding the prohibition of alcohol, as opposed to preservation of faith versus preservation of life. بل يأثم بصبره, but in that case, refusing to drink alcohol and being killed, you are sinful for that patience. والتسمية هذه والتسمية القصر في السفر رخصة مجاز, and calling this a dispensation and calling shortening during travel a dispensation is a metaphorical dispensation. لأن الرخصة الحقيقية يثبت معها الخيار, because a true dispensation is when you have a choice between the azima, the stricter ruling, and the easier ruling, the dispensation. للعبد بين الإقدام على الرخصة وبين الإتيان بالعزيمة, between taking the easier ruling, the dispensation, and between doing the stricter ruling, the azima. كالمسح على الخف, such as wiping over the khuf, which is the dispensation, كما ذكرنا, as we mentioned, and the stricter ruling, which is taking it off and washing the feet. والفطر في رمضان, and breaking the fast during Ramadan, meaning for the traveler, for example. وسقوط وجوب الجمعة, and for the lifting of the obligation of Jum'ah. The traveler, if they pray Jum'ah, that's azima, they're rewarded for it. والعيدين والأضحية, and likewise the Eid prayers, if the traveler attends the Eid prayer, they're rewarded. It's an actual dispensation. Likewise, if the traveler does the udhiyah, they're rewarded for it. ولا تخير له بين شرب الخمر مكرها وصبره على قتله. But one does not have the legal permission between drinking alcohol when coerced. And ikrah, of course, is when there is credible threat of loss of life or limb. And between just being patient and being killed. So, well, I stuck to my deen. Well, stick to the teachings of your deen, not your imagination of the deen. Right? And of course, one of the areas where this applies is people say, well, I was forced to marry her. No. Was anyone going to kill you or chop off anything significant? No. Then you weren't coerced. There's pressure, etc. It's unfortunate. They were sinful for it. But a person has moral agency. And so we shouldn't be harsh on them. But that was an error. Right? Doesn't matter who it is, whatever. This part of the divine honoring of human beings, that they forced me to cheat at work. It's not a dispensation to cheat at work. Corruption. They forced me. Right? The believer is not a banana that you just break it like with a little thing. Right? Istaqimu. Be upright. Right? Right? But you know. ولا بين إكمال الصلاة الرباعية وقصره بالسفر. And likewise, there's no choice between praying 4 rak'ahs and shortening it when travel. So here Imam al-Shurunbulali sort of gathered a whole bunch of things, but there's a little bit of intertwining in this. So it's useful to break down that there's a rukhsa and a azima. So there's a azima and a rukhsa, and the rukhsa is haqiqiyya and majaziyya. What is the rukhsa haqiqiyya? And the examples given. And what's the rukhsa majaziyya? And what are the examples given? To put them all into one diagram. And then prayer is a rukhsa majaziyya. There's no shortening when traveling is a rukhsa majaziyya, because it is it is the azima. It is the original ruling, and it's not an actual dispensation. Because of the texts of Sayyidah Aisha, كانت الصلاة مثنى ثم زيدت في الحضر وأقرت في السفر. Prayer was 2 rak'ahs, and it was increased for the one resident, but remained as it was for the one traveling. That's how we understand it. The Sahaba did differ on this, right? And there's a beautiful quote. I don't recall if Maulana al-Tahtawi mentions it, but al-Zayla'i relates it, and he references it, that this is a matter that Ibn Mas'ud and Sayyidina Uthman differed on during a journey while Sayyidina Uthman was Amir al-Mu'mineen. All morning they're arguing, can the traveler pray the 4 rak'ah prayers in full? And Sayyidina Uthman said, the prayer is the best of matters. You want to take the dispensation, take it. If you don't. And doing more is better. They're arguing all morning. Or they're debating both more. But when they reached the time of prayer, who would lead? Amir al-Mu'mineen, Sayyidina Uthman. He's going to pray as 4 rak'ahs. Who stood right behind him? Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So one of the people in the front row turned to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, said, تُنْكِرُ عَلَيْهِ ثُمَّ تُصَلِّ خَلْفَهُ. You condemn his position and then pray behind him? And Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in, he looked at the man and he said, al-khilafu shar. Divergence is evil. Right? So the position, as it's originally the words of Imam al-Shafi'i, but the Hanafis quoted too, and similar words are related from our Imams, that and you can find in the Durr al-Mukhtar in the Muqaddimah, that إذا سئلنا عن مذهبنا ومذهب. So this what mentioned the Durr. Imam Shafi'i came up with the original expression with the closest wording, but إذا سئلنا عن مذهبنا ومذهب خصمنا, if we're asked about our madhab and the madhab of those we differ from in furu', in detail, in the rulings of religion, نقول مذهبنا صحيح يحتمل الخطأ. Our madhab is correct with the possibility of being incorrect. ومذهب خصمنا خطأ يحتمل الصواب. And the position of our opponent is incorrect with the possibility of being correct. But we use the term صحيح and خطأ, correct and incorrect. We don't say حق and باطل, true and false. But if we're asked in matters of belief about our position versus the position of those against that, we say مذهبنا حق ومذهب خصمنا باطل. And the position of others, this means, of course, those who are outside the framework of Ahl Sunnah, that this is, their position is false, is false, right? There's some detail, of course, because there's da'irat al-khilaf, meaning that opposition that goes outside the khilaf of Ahl Sunnah. Allah. Right, so the suggestion here is not to go telling the Shafi'is that you're wrong, right? Okay. وسقوط وجوب الجمعة والعيدين والأضحية. So he says, عفوا, مسيرة ثلاثة أيام, that the shortest travel in which the rulings change is مسيرة ثلاثة أيام من أقصر أيام السنة, is the traveling distance of 3 days of the shortest days of the year. وقدر بالأيام دون المراحل والفراسخ وهو الأصح. And it was defined by the days, not by the stages of travel or the distance of travel itself, and that's the stronger opinion. Right? And we'll see what that means. Right? So it's masiratu thalathati ayam, it's the distance traveled in 3 days. Bi sayrin wasat. Right, with moderate travel, moderate journeying. Naharan, by day. لأن الليل ليس محلا للسير, because nighttime is not a time for travel, meaning عادة. Right? يعني عادة يعني في زمن الوحي, right? In the time of revelation, which is when the text was revealed. بل للاستراحة, it's a time of rest. ولا بد أن يكون السير نهارا مع الاستراحات, and this travel by day would be with the customary stops. فينزل المسافر فيه للأكل والشرب وقضاء الضرورة والصلاة. So the traveler would come down, would stop. ينزل meaning stop, right? For eating and drinking and fulfilling their needs, and for prayer. وَلِأَكْثَرِ النَّهَارِ حُكْمُ الْكُلِّ, and most of the day has a ruling of the whole day. فإذا خرج قاصدا محلا وبكر في اليوم الأول وسار إلى وقت الزوال حتى بلغ مرحلة فنزل بها للاستراحة وبات بها ثم بكر في اليوم الثاني وسار إلى ما بعد الزوال ونزل ثم بكر في الثالث وسار إلى الزوال فبلغ المقصد قال شمس الأئمة الصحيح أنه مسافر. So if someone started early on the first day and traveled till midday, until Dhuhr time, until they reached, they traveled a day's worth. A marhala is how much you travel in one day. Right? So they fulfilled 1 day's worth of travel. Right? And then they stopped, and then they did so the second day, and then they did so on the third day. So they finished their 3 days of travel in 2.5 days. So did they travel for 3 days? Yes, because it's the traveling of 3 days. It is not traveling 3 whole days. Right? So as-Sarakhsi said, the sound opinion is that they're a traveler. وَاعْتُبِرَ السَّيْرُ الْوَسَطِ سَيْرُ الْإِبِلِ وَمَشْيُ الْأَقْدَامِ فِي الْبَرِّ وَفِي الْجَبَلِ بِمَا يُنَاسِبُهُ. And what is considered is moderate travel, which is the traveling of camels and walking by foot by land, and when traveling in mountainous regions, what would be according to it? Normally people travel lesser distance by mountain. لأنه يكون صعودا وهبوطا, because there's going up and going down. ومضيقا ووعرا, and they could be narrow passages where people slow down, right? Like, where the road becomes narrow, so not as many people are able to travel on it, or the animals have to travel more slowly lest they fall over, etc., right? Especially on mountains. ووعرا, and it could be muddy. فيكون مشي الإبل والأقدام فيه دون سيرها في السهل. So therefore, the traveling of camels or on foot would be less than what it is on sahl, on flat land. فإذا قطع بذلك السير مسافة ليست ببعيدة من ابتداء اليوم ونزل بعد الزوال احتسب به على نحو ما قدمناه. In that case, if they don't travel very far with a customary amount of traveling, right, which would be, and they said للأكثر حكم الكل, that they traveled from morning till zawal, at least the equivalent of half a day with the normal stops. That would be considered 1 day's worth of travel, even if they didn't get very far. They're going up a mountain that day. So by the time they got going, they only crossed a short distance. ثم نزل كان يوما ثانيا, and if they stopped, it would be a second day. ولا يعتبر أعجل السير, and one does not consider the fastest possible travel. وهو سير البريد, and that is the travel of, what is barid?
Post horse.
Yeah, post horse or al-baghl, or mules, right? Because mules would be resilient, especially on like mountain terrains and stuff. ولا أبطأ السير, nor the slowest of travel, right? Which is وهو مشي العجلة التي تجرها الدواب, which is, animal drawn carriages. فإن خير الأمور أوساطها, because the best of matters are the middle matters. وهو هنا سير الإبل والأقدام كما ذكرناه, and that is the travel by camel and by foot, as we mentioned, and because that was the معتاد في زمن الوحي, and that was the customary travel in the time of revelation. وفي البحر يعتبر اعتدال الريح. And by ocean, what is considered is normal wind. على المفتى به, according to the fatwa position. فإذا سار أكثر اليوم كان ككلي. And if one traveled most of the day by sea, it's like traveling all the day. أكثر اليوم meaning most of the daytime. Right? Most of the daytime with the customary traveling by daytime. Right? وإن كانت المسافة دون ما في السهل, even if the travel would end up being less than what it was by land, because it depends on circumstance. You could be traveling against the current or against the wind, etc. So he'll tell us the rulings. Now, there are some people who like causing confusion, but most of the ulama define it by distance in our time, because the customary travel in our times by car or the like, right? Car or train or plane. So they consider that this 3 days of traveling, they define it by the distance, and they make taqdeer. They make taqdeer. Because the 3 days of traveling, this is legally stronger, but even the position. So there's the position of it's 3 days worth of travel. There's another weaker position, which is it's the distance of 3 days travel. But the 3 days of travel, right, the other is the distance of 3 days of traveling. It's not that far apart, because what's meant by 3 days of travel is the travel normally done in 3 days. So if one did that in 2 or in 1 day, and they mentioned, like if someone took a horse and traveled that distance really fast, would they be considered a traveler? Yes. So the fatwa in our times is by distance traveled, right? That's what the ulama across the board say. And then there's some difference about how much exactly is the traveling distance, right? And estimates vary typically between 78 and 87 kilometers, according to the taqdeer of what's considered ثلاث مراحل, 3 days worth of travel. So there's some leeway. And then there's also the discussion that where do you start measuring from? Do you start measuring from? So where do you start measuring from and where do you end measuring from? There are no explicit texts in the madhab, in the major books on the madhab about this. And there's extensive argument amongst contemporary ulama on this. There's a pretty hardcore mufti from Lahore who did a really brutal takedown of some of the muftis from Karachi about this point. But he admits that yes, there are no explicit texts, but how could you say this? This is completely wrong. Which is quite an interesting thing to say, because there aren't explicit texts about it. Right? That you start measuring the distance from, let's say, from home till end point, and there's logically 4 possibilities. Starting point, you could measure it either from home or city limit. Starting point. And the end of the journey could be city limits of the destination or destination point. So there are 4 possibilities. Now, given that's for measuring the journey, but now you're not considered a traveler till you go past city limits. So given that consideration, at least the mashayikh that I've consulted would say that given that when you're within city limits, would you be considered a traveler? No. That you would, the more cautious opinion would be that you start measuring from city limits. right? Because if you're still within the GTA, are you considered I'm a traveler? No, right? So you start measuring. So there's ikhtilaf on this, even amongst the contemporary ulama. But Allahu A'lam, that you start measuring from city limits, and the end point would be your destination point, right? So let's say you're driving to Buffalo. When you reach Buffalo, are you resident then, or are you resident once you reach your destination? And it comes up with prayer, right? That until you reach a place where you stop, and now khalas, now you are resident. And there's ikhtilaf about that. And some say it goes back to your intention. Do you consider, like, once you reach Buffalo, then now you're staying there for 3 weeks, let's say. Are you resident once you reached the city, or once you reached your destination? You got to the house you're staying at, your cousin's house. There's ikhtilaf. The other so they say, the starting would be from city limit, and the end point would be to your destination. If you want to be cautious, then you deem it to be from when you reach the city point. But then what about large urban areas? From the western point of Mississauga to, or let's say from Oakville to Markham, is all part of the Greater Toronto Area. But you're going through different cities, technically. So how do you measure them? That's also a point of khilaf. It comes up elsewhere. Like the big metropolitan areas. So, and there's ikhtilaf from the contemporary ulama about this, but they say the two criteria, that that which is considered part of of a greater metropolitan area would be considered that you're not a traveler there, right? It's like the GTA, for example, the Greater Toronto Area. So is Oakville part of the Greater Toronto Area? Yes. Is Markham part of the Greater Toronto Area? Yes. But is Hamilton part of the Greater Toronto Area? No. What's on the east? Is Oshawa part of the Greater Toronto Area? No. Right? So, now do you have to check the political maps and so on? Like if you get to Chicago and you're like totally confused, like you use your judgment, right? Use your judgment. Do you have to actually measure? And of course, someone wants to be careful. They check before their journey about these kinds of things, right? So that's that is the so he says فيقصر المسافر الفرض العلمي الرباعي. So the traveler, the one who fulfills this criteria, shortens the 4 rak'ah obligatory prayers, right? And the fard al-ilmi, nothing really is excluded from this, right? 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 Unless you want to include like qada ma afsadahu kada, but that's a point of contention, or al-manzur, or if a vowed prayer, etc. The four. فَلَا قَصْرَ فِي الثُّنَائِ لِلثُّنَائِ. There's no shortening in 2 rak'ah prayers. وَالثُّلَاثِ. And there's no shortening in 3 rak'ah prayers. وَلَا لِلْوِتْرِ. Nor of the witr prayer. فَإِنَّهُ فَرْضٌ عَمَلِي. Because it is operationally obligatory. وَلَا فِي السُّنَنِ. And there's no shortening of the sunan. فإن كان في حال نزول وقرار وأمن يأتي بالسنن. Because if one is in a state of rest and settledness and safety, one should do the sunnah. And they differed. Do they become sunnah mu'akkada there, or do they become specifically recommended? It's a mahall of khilaf. It's safer to consider. Like if you're staying somewhere for, if you're a traveler, but let's say you're in London for a week and someone's at a religious conference, but I'm a traveler. What rush are you in? So it's certainly superior. It's either takes the ruling of being recommended or being an emphasized sunnah. وَإِنْ كَانَ سَائِرًا أَوْ خَائِفًا. And if one is traveling or fearful, فَلَا يَأْتِ بِهَا. Then one doesn't do them. Meaning, لَا يَتَأَكَّدْ أَوْ لَا يَتَعَيَّنْ. It's not an emphasized sunnah, or it's not specifically expected. But rather it would be considered generally recommended. So if they did it, they're rewarded for it. وَهُوَ الْمُخْتَارِ. And this is the chosen opinion. Right? قالت عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها فرضت الصلاة ركعتين ثم فزيدت في الحضر وأقرت في السفر إلا المغرب فإنها وتر النهار والجمعة لمكانتها من الخطبة والصبح لطول قراءتها. Right? So of course only the first part is the hadith, right? Sayyida Aisha said that prayer was made obligatory as 2 rak'ahs and 2 rak'ahs. Then it was increased for the one resident and remained for the one traveling. The exception, of course, is Maghrib, because it is the witr of the day, so to speak, and Jum'ah, because 2 rak'ahs were substituted for the khutbah, or it was legislated thus. It's just the hikmah that the khutbah takes the place, because if someone catches Salatul Jum'ah at the end of before the salam of Jum'ah, they have done Jum'ah, there's no qada on them, right? They prayed as Jum'ah, even if they missed the khutbah. It is sinful to miss the khutbah, but they caught the prayer. And subh, because the sunnah is lengthy recitation in it, this is all bayan lil hikmah. وعندنا يقصر من نوى السفر ولو كان عاصيا بسفره. In our madhab, one shortens even if one intends the travel, even if one was traveling for a sinful purpose. Right? Someone was going to Las Vegas to gamble. In our madhab, they would shorten on the journey. Why? كَآبِقٍ مِّن سَيِّدِهِ. Like a runaway slave. وَقَاطِعِ طَرِيقٍ. Or a highway robber. لإطلاق النص الرخصة. Because the text of the dispensation is unconditional. Right? The text, right? That the texts, both of the Quran and the Sunnah, relate to al-musafir, the one who travels. And the one who travels is the one who it's connected with the journey. The intention is something else. One sins for the intention, but the sin is not in the traveling. The sin is in a meaning outside of it. Here we should share, there's a beautiful discussion of this in Tabyin al-Haqa'iq, and quite clear. Tabyin al-Haqa'iq, Sharh Kanz al-Daqa'iq of al-Zayla'i, has a brief but very good discussion on this. And then he says, إِذَا جَاوَزَ بُيُوتَ مُقَامِهِ. If they shorten and the dispensations applies if one goes past the final buildings of their place of residence. وَلَوْ بُيُوتَ الْأَخْبِيَةِ مِنَ الْجَانِبِ الَّذِي خَرَجَ مِنْهُ. Even the outlying houses of the inhabitations from the direction that they're traveling from. وَلَوْ حَذَاهُ فِي أَحْدِ جَانِبَيْهِ فَقَطْ لَا يَضُرُّهُ. But if the city is not shaped evenly, so they're outside the city limits from the city limits and its contiguous outlying areas, they're beyond that, but in other directions they would still be within the city's perimeter, the outside city limits. So a city is shaped like a heart, for example, and they left from the inflection point, right? If you drew a circle around the city, they're within the perimeter, but they're outside the city limit from the point that they traveled, they're outside city limits. And then he'll give us details related to this. We'll stop here for today. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.
78 to 82 kilometers. Is that for considered only for easy land travel, or is that all the travel that's mentioned by sea, by air, by mountain, and by easy land travel?
It will be the same. Because right? Because air travel is not this. There's no mu'tad that relating to the time of revelation. So then you take it back to the asl, which is land travel, and say the same principle would apply for air travel. Because otherwise, if you were to travel 3 days by air, it would mean that no one flying around the world would ever be a traveler. Right? Yes?
But Mr. Bulali mentions that travel by sea can be different and even shorter than land travel. So would it be considered for air unique distance besides the distance we decided for land travel?
What basis would you have?
Current norms. Current norms
Current norms of what?
of air travel.
What would that be? Like air travel on a 1 hour journey, you'll get to like New York City. Right? You'll get to Montreal. Right? Easily. Right? So there's no alternative but to consider the distance customarily traveled during the Sayr al-Mu'tad will be during of that kind of traveling, which they traveled by those animals. You don't consider traveling by horses, for example, right? And when they used to, for example, someone was in a rush, how would they travel? They would swap horses. Okay? So when Sultan Nuruddin al-Zenji had the vision of the Prophet ﷺ that they're trying to dig up his grave, and he was in Damascus, he went himself from Damascus to Medina, and and they're swapping horses the whole journey, and he went himself with a select group of his commanders. They got to Medina and they rounded up everyone in the city, and they actually found that a couple of people who had claimed to be converts to Islam and who'd purchased a house not too far from the Haram al-Nabawi, they were actually digging a tunnel. So he inquired, who didn't come? And he said, there's gifts for everyone who comes. And Medina didn't have a large population. And he inquired, who didn't show up? And they're these converts. They went and and they searched their house, and they dug a tunnel. They're trying to dig up the grave of the Prophet ﷺ. There, and it said that they weren't that far from getting under. Allahu Akbar. So is it possible to travel that distance much faster? But in that case, once you've left city limits, let's say you're traveling a distance much faster there. Once you leave city limits, and that distance would normally have been traveled in 3 days, you're considered a traveler. If you do it much faster, if you do it much slower, then your journey would be considered.